It's ad break time. I am proud to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast is sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. Right now, they have a crowdfunding campaign on BackerKit for not one, but two different games, Making History by Nick Proctor and Witch Hunt 1649 by Martha McGill. Making History uses scattered information about a breakup to teach historical lessons as players try to piece together what really happened, while Witch Hunt gives insight into the social and economic forces behind witch hunts in Scotland. Both are fascinating, and you should check them out before the campaign ends on August 7th. But for now, let's get on with the show. Hey, gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and this week in the pod, I'm here with J. Ray Lee. He is a writing teacher at the University of Washington, Bothell, and he's also the author of Unsettling Catan, Detached Design in Eurogames. This is the very first volume in the tabletop game series coming out from the University of Michigan Press. So, how you doing today, Jay?
I'm doing good. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm super happy to have you on to talk about your book. So, for people who know absolutely nothing about this series, which is probably a lot of people because it's new, what is the idea behind the series, and how is your book kind of matching that as the lead-off title?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the basic idea behind the series is that we're trying to reach a space that we think hasn't really been reached so far in board game discussions. And so, there isn't really a lot of books that are even just featuring individual hobby game titles. Honestly, if you look at the history of publication, there are books on chess, there are books on Go. That might be just about it. There's a lot of great conversations that are happening on your channel, on BGG, on a lot of different places, but we don't really have like a book publishing industry that is concerned with games on the level that we see with pretty much any other media you can name. Like you can go to the library and find, you know, thousands of analyses of novels, of films, even now of video games. So we want to reach that space that hasn't really been reached yet. And we want to do it specifically in a way that bridges the gap between academic understandings and a popular general audience, because we really think that keeping things siloed within academia isn't really going to help much. So, like, we could proliferate this thing if we want, but if it can't engage with the community, then we feel like there isn't necessarily a huge point. And I should say that I keep saying we here, and Paul and Aaron, the editors of this, were previously on your channel, so I don't want to be the one who's speaking for everyone, but that's kind of the feel that I'm kind of bringing to what we're doing.
Yeah, for context, everybody, I'll remember to link this in the show notes. Paul Booth and Aaron Trammell were on this show several seasons ago and mentioned that this book series was going to happen. And so now we are finally coming full circle. It's really launching, and your book comes out in November, right?
Mm-hmm, that's correct.
Excellent. So I think Catan is a really obvious starting place for a book series like this. But what made you want to write about Catan specifically?
Yeah, so it's funny that you say that, because that's what Paul thinks and that's what Aaron thinks. It wasn't really my idea. I actually wrote a design diary post on this a little bit. So I've written about Catan 2017, maybe, just an article in Analog Game Studies. And I think it's really important for me when I'm writing about big issues in games that I want to talk about games that are well known and influential. So I wrote an academic article, probably the one that's kind of like most closely related to what you do in terms of like the historical wargaming thing. And I used Risk, and so like people who are in the wargaming community would probably freak out, maybe, you know, to be using Risk as an exemplar for that. Now, I don't specifically argue that Risk is an example of that kind of historical wargaming, but I wanted to argue about sort of like colonialism and mapping in how like we literally draw pictures of the world on our game boards. And so I wanted to make that more accessible through Risk. So in terms of Catan, when Paul and Aaron kind of floated the idea of like, this is a great launching point for the series, I really wanted to be able to say, how can we have a really interesting conversation that comes out of a game that is recognizable, it's popular, it's simple and family friendly in some ways, has a status in the gaming community, but isn't necessarily the kind of thing that would be lifted up as this is the best example of historical gaming. This is the best example of philosophical gaming. This is not necessarily something we think about as um, doing something that's trying to make a social statement. And, I just believe in general with media, that stuff exists in every medium, right? You have great people on your channel who are doing great stuff with board gaming. You have great stuff in the world of art and film and literature who are doing all kinds of great stuff. But sometimes, I'm just like a pop culture guy. And so, I want to ask, okay, well, what's going on with Marvel? You know what I mean? Like, what's going on with Taylor Swift? Like, these are the things that I think are impacting our culture. And so being able to talk about that, this is the kind of thing that when I talk about it with my students, they light up. Like I had countless Swifties, who are in my class who are able to like write a little piece on Taylor Swift and to pull meaning that's related to the meaningfulness that they engage in their life, because when they listen to that music, it is meaningful to them on a personal level. And so then when we teach critical thinking and analysis, then the critical thinking and analysis is now also meaningful to them on another level, which is again the whole point of this series, to be able to say that we can't just analyze things that academics find fun and interesting, like when I was in grad school, and Derrida and this kind of theory was the thing. It's like people would dig up the most Derridian novels you could find, and so like there's these authors who are writing this really experimental stuff that's designed for the critical theory, and then they use the critical theory to analyze the novel and be surprised, I found something interesting here. It's obvious that that's going to be there because that artist was trying to like get theorists attracted. Like they had the fishing hook with the little Derrida worm on it, and people would grab it, and then they would write those articles. And those articles aren't all bad. Some of them are bad. But again, yeah, like if you wrote on Marvel or Harry Potter or whatever it is, like I'm personally more interested in that.
Nice. So you mentioned teaching and pop culture. What is it? I mean, you're teaching writing right now,
Mhm.
but what is your area of research? And are games the primary thing, or are they part of a larger whole?
Um, they're the primary thing now. So my training is in comparative literature and philosophy, and I was actually in the middle of kind of working up my first book on kind of like the philosophy of names and descriptions in these realist novels. And I was doing this project on Lego for fun on the side, kind of, and it took over. That started out as a 15-minute conference presentation and turned into the outline for an article, which turned into the outline for 3 articles, which turned into the outline for, I think I published a book and 2 other articles on Lego. Um, and it just kind of happened because I was just looking at one, that kind of popular thing of, okay, this is a medium that is just really influential in people's lives. I had a fun conversation where you kind of like at a mixer and you're talking about what you do, and I said I write on Lego. This was a while back, and one of these academic type people is like, "Oh, you mean this Italian poet Lego?" And like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm talking about the toy. um, and so I just I did I was getting into it, and I was thinking about it, and I was doing my library research, and I was just not coming up with anything. People weren't talking about it much. And so I feel like this is just like a big gap area for academia. We don't really engage with certain aspects of popular culture, and my suspicion is we specifically don't engage in aspects of popular culture that relate to play, because we don't have good theorization of what it would look like to combine play and media. So when we talk about play, we talk about developmental psychology. When we talk about media, we talk about traditional storytelling forms of art like literature and film. And even video games is able to kind of like worm its way into that conversation because there's enough of a narrative element, and like the switch from the early Pac-Man arcade moment to these big sprawling narrative games really attracted all the literature and film scholars to be able to say, like, I can still come up with something. And then we've developed now new ways of talking about video games. There's now terminology that exists that applies to video games that applies to nothing else in the world. Um, there isn't really terminology that applies to board game studies that applies to nowhere else in the world, except on BGG, and the way people talk about mechanisms and stuff within the design community and all those kinds of things is not coming from an academic space necessarily. And so, again, bridging this gap and being able to say, we're developing a new form of discourse here on Beyond Solitaire, here in the board gaming community. And board gaming is not developing its own new kind of discourse because academia doesn't pay attention to this kind of thing. And so, again, the series tries to carve out a space for that. My book tries to engage in that. I have one chapter that could be the throwaway chapter for you. If you love Catan, you can throw away this chapter, but it's just a chapter on this discussing what it means to look at a board game and actually kind of doing a little bit of media theory on that and saying, okay, how is this different from film? How is this different from literature? And for me, setting that up before like diving into all my analysis was really important and interesting for getting that out there. But I mean, I think the other thing that I really want to not lose sight of is analyzing Catan. And because we don't have all these books on single titles out there, I really wanted to spend a lot of time in the chapter saying, okay, let's pay a lot of sustained attention to this kind of thing. So have a whole chapter on placing hexes, have a whole chapter on rolling the dice. And it's, Catan can be broken down into like 7 very simple mechanisms. Nobody has confusion about rolling the dice is, but like being able to spiral a whole conversation about, okay, rolling the dice, and that relates to the idea of fate, fatalism versus rationalism. And so like all these big ideas, and the way that Eurogames engage that is maybe specifically different than the way that, Efka, from No Pun Included, recently talked about sausage sizzle as a way of doing kind of a similar thing to what I'm doing with Catan, of saying, okay, this simple thing can have a big reasoning behind it. But the way I think he talks about randomness in that is very different from the way that Eurogames handle randomness, where they're like, let's give you randomness, but then take it away because too much randomness would be like this anarchic space that we can't handle, or whatever the reason.
All right, so to pull it to the book specifically, I just want to kind of read this quote for everybody out there, because I feel like this is your big, like, the thing that you're unsettling, right? Is Klaus Teuber's thoughts about his design itself. So, like in one of the title pages, it says from him, "I'd expressly designed Catan to be a peaceful game in which participants did not fight, but instead traded and cooperated with each other. A game in which every player, even if they lost, could retain their dignity and be proud of the little empire they had created." There's a lot going on in there.
Yeah, I don't know if I haven't counted it, if I've quoted that in every chapter, but at least more than half of the chapter, I throw that same quote back in there, because I think there's so many dimensions of the design and the culture that come out in that book. So the first one being just the idea of the peaceful feelings. Like, I want to create a game that feels peaceful to people. And I think that for me, if I didn't really live through the early history of Eurogames, so I always feel like I wish that somebody who'd experienced that could kind of like speak up and weigh in on this conversation of how people were really feeling and thinking about it at the time. But I look back at some of these games, and unfortunately, I can only talk about Catan in the book. But I think about El Grande, I think about Through the Desert, thinking about Carcassonne. These are all mean area control games. So when we think about Euro games, we don't think about area control being the dominant mechanism, but like almost every early Euro game that I think of that's really had a major impact was area control. It was mean, but it covered it in something. And so like El Grande said, let's have this super brutal, mechanistically cutthroat game, but then let's kind of invent area control in certain sense. And I'm not going to argue if it was really the first or not, but by saying, we're not actually killing each other when we fight over this territory. We're vying for influence. And somehow at the end of the game, I've beaten you through cutthroat maneuvers, but because it's more of a Cold War than an actual war, I can actually feel kind of good about myself. And these other things, like Carcassonne uses its pastoral setting and the fact that you can share points and things like that. And so you have all these things where it's like what you're doing should feel violent, but the games don't. And so I actually kind of have a poll that someone ran on Catan to talk about, like, does it feel aggressive or does it feel peaceful? And some people think it feels aggressive, but some people feel like it actually feels peaceful, despite the fact that nothing that you're doing in the game really feels all that peaceful, including the part that in that quote Toiber talks about saying is the peaceful part. It's a trading and negotiation. Um, for me, again, trading and negotiation is another one of those genres. It's a cutthroat genre. You know what I mean? Um, like I just listened to you talking with Zoe Allred about this kind of weird semi-co-op space where, if everybody can win and you have negotiation in that, it's a very different feeling. But that's not what we're talking about. Like when we talk about trading and negotiation games, we're talking about we cooperate to an extent in order to have one person eventually be the winner. When that person is, the winner, it eliminates the cooperative element that Toiber is talking about. So, it's just like all these things, like how can we put a twist on things to make what we're doing feel peaceful? And then, that seems like it's like a weird niche design conversation. And so if you're not a game designer, who cares? Well, for me, I'm not a game designer. Um, but the reason that I care is that last part where he talks about you can feel proud of your little empires. And so then the idea starts being, well, okay, well, what if you combine this idea of we want cutthroat mechanisms to feel peaceful with the idea that we have these implicitly colonialist themes feeling peaceful? Now I'm starting to get like red flags, right? And I don't want to specifically blame, any of the designers. Toiber actually thought about colonialism and was trying to genuinely create something that he thought would be uplifting for society as a family gaming kind of thing. And so, I don't want to discount that at all. I really respect what Toiber was doing there, but at the same time, just saying, well, sometimes you want a cutthroat mechanism combined with a violent theme to make you uncomfortable. And so that's why the title of the book is Unsettling Catan. I know that a lot of people who love art of any kind love art that makes us feel uncomfortable. Like, if I watch a film and I say that it made me cry, you inherently think of that as a compliment.
Yeah.
Right. You didn't, the first thing that popped in your mind was it, oh, this film was so bad that he had to run screaming from the theater, right? Like that's not what you think. Like with every other form of art, we say, okay, if this moved me, if this elicited reactions, and it's not just crying and sadness, but like anger and frustration, things like that. Like all the way back to Aristotle, the idea of catharsis and just like pushing people through these rough emotions in art, because like it's part of the human condition is that we need to experience these kind of emotions. Um, that's what we want, right? And so if we close that down, and then specifically if we close that down and pair it with these kind of complex themes like colonialism or capitalism, or it doesn't have to be those specific ones, even though those are the ones I talk about the most in the book, but really pairing it with anything that's of any sort of ethical or emotional complexity, and then you try and close that down, I think that that's just kind of a negative for how gaming functions as art.
So you mentioned the first part of the title is called Unsettling Catan, but this also leads, I think, into uh, the fact that we need to talk about the second part, which is detached design in Euro games. What is detached design? Is this a term that you have coined yourself for this book? And what made you choose this as the focus?
Yeah, so it is a term that I coined for the book. I went through several different iterations of things that I want to talk about. Um, you know, how you name things is complicated, and there's a little bit of chicken and the egg. What comes first? And so, like, I looked at abstraction. I looked at um, historical fantasy. I looked at detachment, different kinds of things. But what we talked about with peacefulness and the generation of that peaceful feeling, detached design, I'm calling kind of like the culture of producing peaceful feelings. And so the best way to illustrate that through Eurogames specifically is everything that Eurogames are famous for is kind of an example of detached design. So Eurogames are famous for putting mechanisms over theme. And so they're saying, think, don't feel. I mean, that's basically the implicit message when you say that the theme doesn't matter and the mechanisms matter. And so that's a form of detachment, is being able to say, like, we've elicited emotions, but you're detached from them. You're removed from experiencing the emotions. And this is why I quickly rejected the idea of talking about like abstracted design, because abstracted is like literally removed. I could take all of the theme out of Catan and just say, this is Hex Island, try and accumulate the most green and win or something like that. But Catan isn't that, right? It is an island. It has a theme to it. Detachment says, I'll give you a theme, put the mechanisms over the theme. And so there's a kind of like emotional repression that's happening of I want to bring something artistically in a person and then stamp it down. So the aesthetics, the second thing that Eurogames are super famous for is just being beige. And there's a way, the way that people talk about it in the community is sometimes people are too lazy or they're too cheap to come up with good art, or they just don't care about that, so it's a low priority. I don't think that that's true. I think it's a high priority for them to create art that creates a certain kind of feel to it. And when we think about beigeness, we think about a certain kind of nostalgic view of history. Like we put sepia filters on anything that we want to put that onto. We think about parchment, and like the beigification of reality is the putting it into this kind of like detached historical space where you feel like it's history, but I'm specifically putting that frame that makes me feel a distance for it. There's actually a lot of board games that actually, it's not just beige, but like, you know, the board will be, framed with like a little inkwell in the corner or a little notebook or things like that, that makes you framed like you're not immersing yourself in the world, but you are yourself a historian who's sitting outside of the game looking at papers about the world or things like that. So like Arc Nova doesn't do the beige, for example, but I think about that as like a really great example of, the detachment from running a zoo, of, like you feel like a middle manager in that game because the graphic design is all like file folders and things like that, that makes you feel like an administrator. And so like that's an example of aesthetics that are specifically designed to be detached. And so, and then another one is the idea that all Euro games are multiplayer solitaire instead of interactive. And that's another form of detachment, because like if you can detach yourself from the social space and say like I'm with you, but I'm not interacting with you meaningfully. And again, that's a little bit of a misconception. These games are interactive in certain ways, but the point is that the design is in some ways suppressing or detaching you from the feeling that you're interacting with someone. So we take away the aspects that feel too cutthroat. We take away the direct attacking, and then we allow for like all those early Euro games where we are doing interactive things, we are doing cutthroat things, but we feel like we're kind of like all peaceful around the table and things like that. So those are just a couple examples, but like for me, detachment was really interesting because it provided a key for all of these things that we actually observe within Eurogaming, and we've named them within Eurogaming, but we haven't always thought about them as all different symptoms of the same core phenomenon, and that same core phenomenon is an ideological one, and it's the ideological one of kind of like closing our eyes to what we're doing, turning away from the artistry of our actual art. And like I don't want to be like a big, like make a big political deal about this, but like I think that that's just not good art. That's not what we want. I would love to see people who have just more immersion in what we're doing as a medium. It's part of, you know, you can analyze stuff that doesn't do that, but I think just doing that as much as possible is what we want. And it, at the very least, just raises interesting questions. So lets me feel, okay, this artistry isn't just bad art. It's not just bad graphics. It's not just bad whatever. It's doing something interesting that I can talk about. So, yeah.
Yeah. I find it very interesting that you mentioned that you don't want to get all political about it. I do think this is an inherently political conversation, and I want to talk about how you manage that, especially because when we talk about detached design, a lot of times what we're detaching from is colonialism, which is something that has a huge legacy in our world now and not a positive one. So Toiber himself tries to kind of get around colonialism very explicitly. But you also mentioned, games like Maracaibo that are like, well, it's there, but shh, just keep playing. It's fine. And so, how do you handle talking about detached design, what it is that you are in fact detaching from, which is sometimes pretty serious, and then your desire to not quote get political or not put value judgments into the work.
I think in some ways, just the gap between where we are and where we want to be is so big that I don't feel like I can carry the ball the whole way in some ways. And so it's not that I want to say that political conversation shouldn't happen, but before I can even have a conversation about Maracaibo and like whether it's a good idea to make a game that is about colonialism and shows the bad sides about it, or whether it's a bad idea to make a game about colonialism, or whether it should be done in a different way. And I do talk about the expansion in the final chapter and how that twists things in an interesting way. I think that, we just need to do some shedding ourselves of the myth of detached design before that conversation can even get off the ground. And so when I say I don't want to be political, there's obviously political implications to both the games that I talk about and to the way that I talk about them. But I think that what I want to do in the book is just kind of focus on the way that the desire to not have the political conversation is structured. And I call it detached design instead of detached emotion, because I actually think that this is built into the art. Like the art is actually saying, let's produce a culture of detachment around itself. And so once you deconstruct that, once you unravel that, once you recognize the problem, you name the problem, you can see it for yourself, then you can start having other conversations, whether it's within the design community or within the player community. And now we can have a big political debate about things if we want to, because we've freed ourselves of some of the baggage that makes that debate impossible. And just for me, I think, this is the first book in the series, and I just don't want to be too ambitious, honestly. And so, like, when I got to some of those political possibilities for a conversation, where I got to the places where I could make a statement, I was like, okay, I'm going to let the conversation develop. I'm not going to weigh in too heavily there. I don't want me to be the person who's saying this is the right way to do everything. I just want the conversations to happen. And so, like, I think of myself as the clearing the ground person, not the necessarily having the conversation person. Um, but I very much hope the conversation will keep happening, and I know the conversation is happening. I feel like that might have been a too egotistical way of framing it. So, like, it's already happening, but I think the more that we unsettle certain aspects of the things, the more that the conversation will be unburdened to be able to flow and move more freely. And I really have a lot of faith in the creativity of our community. Like, I think that once those conversations happen more and more and more, people will come up with all kinds of great ideas that I won't necessarily have been able to come up with myself. I think people will come up with ideas that contradict each other, but then they'll implement both of those ideas, and I'll be happy to have two contradictory viewpoints on my shelf next to each other. Like, I think that that's a great thing. So again, like, for me, the only goal is to open up the space for conversation as much as possible. And anything that I could say that would narrow that and push it in a single direction is something that I wanted to avoid.
Interesting. So another thing that we're kind of detached from, I guess, that comes up a couple of times in the book is, Toyber wants to present the game as cooperative. It's inherently kind of conflicty because somebody has to win. But the presence of knights and armies within a game that is apparently about peaceful settlement does seem a little bit jarring when you really think about it. So, how do you maintain a sense of peace and cooperation while also having those things like present in a game?
Well, I mentioned this a little bit, but we talk about the UN has a peacekeeping force. We talk about the United States as America's global police force. That's not a good thing, by the way. Um, but we actually that's a contradiction that our culture has embraced for a long time. Every war that's ever been waged has been waged in the name of peace, right? And so we strongly believe as a culture that there are non-peaceful methods of forging peace. And so, like, this shoot first, ask questions later mentality, or even just the threat of it. So we talk about kind of, the idea is if everybody has a nuclear bomb, then nobody will drop one because we can't handle the consequences of it. And so this mutually assured destruction is another idea. And so we've integrated war and peace in our cultural imaginary for I don't know how many thousands of years. Like, that's just the way things are. And so when a game says you're not allowed to fight with anybody, but you're going to get points for having the largest army, that is kind of a representation of mutually assured destruction. Like, you gain power by doing a show of force, not necessarily by exerting force. And there's a belief that that's a peaceful thing. And I want to unsettle that. I want to unsettle the idea that the only way to produce peace is through militarization. Actually, when you say it out loud, it almost kind of unsettles itself. You think, wait, why would someone think that the best way to forge peace is to mass produce weapons? Well, this is one of the things that gaming can make you ask yourself, right? Um, I think the game itself, like the design of Catan, doesn't do anything that specifically encourages people to think that way. I think that that's a conversation that, as someone who's coming in and writing about it, I want to be able to have, both to show the contradiction that a game can say peace and then kind of do imagery of war, but then also to dig into that and say that this reveals something about itself. And this is also to mention, this is something that happens in tons of Euro games. And so, like we mentioned, Euro games always want this peaceful feeling. You're going to find a soldier or a gun or something on the art of so many Euro games that aren't about that at all. It's just, it's in the air that Euro games breathe, that when you talk about history, the peace is maintained by this military apparatus that we just take for granted and we don't question it. And, literally my only job, the only thing that I do is I just ask questions about things. That's just my thing.
Yeah, some of the questions I also appreciated in the book were sort of talking about representation of people in these games. There are soldiers and knights, but laborers are not really entirely visible in a game that is in fact about settling and gathering resources. So I guess that's actually that's a major problem that people have discussed in war games. I mean, not war games, in Euro games for some time. Notably Jason Perez did a lot of work on that on Shelf Stories, that you spend workers without any regard for the humanity. They're people that you don't pay. To what extent do you think that Catan kind of laid the foundation for that, versus just it was expressing something that we all just kind of naturally are willing to elide?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in comparison to some of those other games that I mentioned, like El Grande, I think labor is much less of a question for that. So I think Catan definitely made an impact on that. The idea of economic war being peaceful and military war being not peaceful is something that is at the heart of Euro games. And so, like I mentioned, so many Euro games have a military component somewhere in the art or theme, but almost every Euro game, it's economics that is the actual battleground. And so the idea is that we have this culturally capitalist notion that any kind of economic competition is inherently good for society. A rising tide raises all ships and these kinds of things. And so there's so much positive emotions around capitalism. So with colonialism in Euro games, it's the dirty little secret. We want to have it, but we recognize that it's contradictory, and so we use detached design to kind of like smooth out the things. And so even some of the most controversial colonialist Euro games do that. So Puerto Rico, it's like, okay, we're kind of representing slavery, but we're going to make these workers discs so that it doesn't feel like it. Or I talk about, like, in Mombasa, we're like literally colonizing Africa, but the rule book says, please don't think about that too much. Which is, in the history of art, the move of like, let's make this evocative art about a theme and then like just add a little tag to the side, like in the museum next to the painting. Just look at the art, but don't think about what this is about. Okay, I'm gonna go off on a rant here. But coming back to like labor in Catan, labor and capitalism are built into Euro games so deeply that it's hard for them to do the kind of denial that they do of, oh, just pretend the military stuff doesn't exist. You can't pretend that the labor question doesn't exist in Euro games, where the most popular mechanism is worker placement. And so Catan didn't invent worker placement, certainly, and that's not what it's doing. But the idea of Catan is, let's have an economic competition. Fundamentally, it's about the growth of society. It's really about working people, because it's about the people who settle the land, farm the land, build new settlements for each other. And so when you're competing over territory in Catan, you're competing over living space. You're not competing over borders, or because the borders are all crisscrossed each other. It's not national might or power or things like that. You're competing for, like, let me just get the most flourishing land to produce the most food for the highest number of people, because your points are tracked by, your cities are worth 2 points, your settlements are worth 1 point. That's basically just indexing population. So you could kind of argue that the winner of Catan is roughly the the civilization with just the highest population at the end of the game. Um, but it pretends that labor doesn't exist, right? So, like, it shows the knights, it doesn't show the workers. And I think that, when you have this kind of like top down managerial thing in most Euro games, where in most Euro games you're not playing as a person with a backstory or a single character, you don't know anything about yourself, you're playing as the empire, the little empire. So you're playing as the sum population, or the administrator of the population, or some noble who's trying to get prestige, or whatever it happens to be. And so you're playing as someone who can't do anything in the world. So when you play a dungeon crawl or something like that, I'm a hero, I have a lot of strength, I have magic, I have something that makes me powerful. The thing that makes you powerful in Euro games is, I'm the one who controls the industrial apparatus. I'm the one who controls the labor. I'm the one who is the manager who tells people what to do. And so capitalism is based on the fact that capital accrues capital. So the rich get richer because they have the laborers do the work, and then they skim a piece off the top of all that work. Because if I own the apple orchard, I can have 1,000 people each pick some apples, sell the apples at the market, and then they each just give me $10 or something like that. And then I've done nothing and I've made money. And so in Euro games, you don't do nothing. You make strategic decisions, but it's all based on profiting off of labor. And so then the question of representation, of who is represented, who isn't represented, and how they're represented. So I just have like a little graphic where I just take the worker meeples from every game that I talk about, and I just line them up, and I took a picture of it. It's just like, look at how all these things, all like the meeple is actually the single brand image for hobby board gaming, not even just Euro games. Like so many channels and so many things, like you can get merch that's just meeple merch. The word meeple is coined by a gamer, Allison Hansel, and there's a whole weird thing about the company trying to steal that term from them and trademark it, or that we don't need to go into that. But it's short for my people, and it just has this kind of inherently possessive, like, these are my people. Like, I am not the commander of mighty armies, I'm the commander of mighty labor forces, and I'm the manager of it, and I'm detached from that. I don't have to feed them all the time. I occasionally, like, feed your people is almost the only worker humanizing mechanism that's remotely common in Eurogaming. And even that is really problematic, because you have this kind of rule that's often, you feed the people or you lose victory points if you fail to feed the people. And so the implication there is that you're more than welcome to starve your workforce, but they won't die and they won't quit. Right? You'll just lose prestige for being just like a bad boss, but there's no actual, it's almost like not a moral accountability, it's more just like a social capital accountability. And like, as the detached manager, um you know I the last time I played Stone Age, I won the game on a starvation strategy, where I just like, I bit the penalty for not feeding my workers, and then had a huge workforce and got the points other ways. And so, it says basically, as a simulation, it's not bad for that to be a simulation, to be able to say, okay, let's explore this possibility in games. But it's just worth noting that that's a common thing, where like, if I'm not interrogating my own gameplay, like, I just feel smart. And we have, I definitely don't want to go here, but I'm kind of accidentally going here. But like, we have a person who I will not name, who said in a debate, "I'm smart because I exploited my workers and didn't derail the campaign at all." And so, like, that's just the culture that these games are engaging in. And again, I'm an unsettlement guy. I'm a philosophical question asking guy, and so I just want to ask, well, what are we doing here? Right? That's what it all boils down to.
Yeah. So clearly, there's a lot we should be doing that we should probably think about, and it's not comfortable, and it's not going to necessarily make us feel like we are good. But we're all playing these games anyway. You're gaming, I'm gaming. How do you deal with the feelings of unsettlement versus the desire to play, and also not wreck people's game night or like get so political that it chases people off that you want to think about the question?
There's a time and a place for everything, right? So I'm not saying that we need to be in this critical mode all the time. I'm not in this critical mode all the time. Sometimes when I'm playing a game, I'm just playing the game. And sometimes I'm thinking about it later. So, like a lot of what I talk about, the way that it's written might feel like I'm describing having all these thoughts and feelings during the actual moment of the game night. That's not usually true. Usually it's like um, there's a work of reflection, and I'm part of, as like a writer. Um, my goal is not necessarily to become the kind of person who thinks this way at every moment of my life, but to be able to unravel the things that are already present in my life. So the thing about detachment is it's different from emotional deadness. It's different from saying I don't have the capacity for emotions. It's about saying I'm not experiencing my emotions in the moment, or I'm not naming my emotions. And so the retrospective kind of looking back later and figuring out what was going on, it's kind of like detective work. And that's something that I'm able to kind of maybe do after the fact. And so it doesn't ruin my game night, honestly, to be able to do that. For some people, like everybody's different. If there are games that, if playing Mombasa will ruin your game night or will ruin the game night for others, because I actually think that there's a big hosting ethics of, if you are inviting new people to something, you want to be really careful about what you invite them to do, because there's a kind of social contract of, they're asking for you a good time, and not necessarily colonizing Africa. Right. And so like I do think that if I was going to say like there's some games that I would change my game night over, it's a specifically changing my game night over the welcoming of new people in public spaces and things like that. I would literally change my behavior over that. In terms of my own personal play and my own personal fun, um, I'm as somebody who's been talking about, I grew up loving literature and then got a PhD in literature. I love grew up loving games. Now I'm writing about games. Um, I believe people when they say that any sort of critical stuff about the game ruins their experience. And if that's you, then you make your own decisions. I just don't experience that. Like thinking about things more deeply for any kind of art, any kind of media that exists, just only enriches the experience for me. And yeah, there are maybe particular games that I become less happy with, but there's other games that I become more happy with. And even I can still play just like a silly thing, and it doesn't bother me. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that I don't know if I have great advice for this. If everybody needs to navigate it for themselves, but I just don't think that it's inherently contradictory to say we need to have conversations and we can just have silly fun. I think we can do both.
All right, I want to pull this back to academia and academic
Mhm.
culture. So this is perhaps just my personal experience, although I think a lot of people who are post-ac had this while they were in. I felt like a lot of the work that I was doing was not supposed to be popular work, and that there's almost like a current against having things that were too pop culture or too like not for an aggressively academic audience. And so, how do you see your book's placement in terms of its place on your CV and in your academic career?
Oh well, I mean that's easy. Being on a writing teaching track, my research is just not weighed heavily into what I do. And so typically what happens is the people who are specifically on the tenure track, who are specifically doing their first books in order to actually get tenure, are heavily constrained in what they're able to write. And so what you see is sometimes the most boundary pushing work is either a senior scholar who's already proven so much that they can just do anything that they want and people will publishing it, anything that they want to say. That's not me. um, I'm the person who's kind of like on the fringes of the academic job market, so I can do anything that I want and nobody will comment on it. And so I do think that both when I was writing on Lego and was writing on board games, I had this initial shock of I'm way too late in the game to be this groundbreaking on things like that. Um, but then I looked at the people who were writing things, and it's like, okay, everyone who published on Lego was writing something that wasn't necessarily doing like new Lego focused theory, because this person is a psychologist, and here's how the thing that they wrote about Lego has to be legible to their psychological institution. This person is a historian. This person is like every single person. Like when you become familiar with academic reading, you can kind of like read a little bit and say, oh, I can guess what your background is, because of the way that you're writing about it. And so what happens is pop culture analysis tends to be done by people from all across all kinds of different disciplines who are using pop culture to become a little bit more accessible while talking about something that's core to their core discipline. And so what happens is Lego studies never becomes Lego studies. Board game studies never becomes board game studies, because there's no institutional structure that says we will actually support the publication for a bunch of board gaming stuff. Which is why when Paul and Aaron created this book series, they're able to say, okay, these books are going to be shorter and less academic than a typical academic publishing, because the people who are writing these books, we're trying to lure people who aren't necessarily trying to use this as their tenure publication book. They're trying to just like do good research. And so like if we create a space for people to say, here's a place where you can publish good pop culture research that doesn't have to be legible in every single way that your typical stuff would do, if you create that space, people will come into it. And there has been a lot of interest in the series from authors wanting to do this. So it's great. I'm happy that we're able to do that. Academia is changing a bit, so like this sounds very negative. There are specific institutions who are like having meetings and saying, okay, can we actually revise our tenure requirements to say that we will accept creative art projects or pop culture projects or things like that. There are more institutions that are offering grants for faculty to do public scholarship, things like that. So there is a recognition, I think, that academia doing things the old way is not going to work for us long term, which is great. So I'm glad that I could be in this moment where that kind of change is is happening, but it's slow. Academia is one of the more slow conservative kind of things, not necessarily politically conservative, but
Right.
if you want to make any sort of change, you have this massive inertial resistance on behalf of people who've been doing things a certain way for 50 years. And there's such a sense that when you want to make a big change, you can't be just like the corporate person, like come in, bring a new CEO, throw everything into disarray, and then that CEO leaves in a year. Like academia just doesn't move fast at all. But it is moving. It is happening.
Yeah. And then how do you feel about, so one thing that I've really enjoyed watching change just from doing my podcast over the years, is I feel like academia is slowly also, as we talked about, increasing its willingness to take certain things seriously. So like video game studies is now huge. But I feel like board games are still lagging a little bit behind. What is your perception of board games as a growing academic topic? And do you think that we're going to see more in years to come?
Absolutely. I think we're definitely on an upward trend. I will say, I would bet strongly that we're never going to match video games. Like, I just don't see that happening. And the reason for that is that video games have a very specific function within academic studies, which is the kind of like the bridge between humanities, art-based criticism, and digital cultures. And so everybody knows that the internet has caused a social revolution, kind of like on the order of the Industrial Revolution. Like anyone says, okay, you know, you know, we've lived through and we've experienced this massive social transformation. The internet did it, social media did it, AI is now also doing it. And so when people are in cultural studies and when people are things, how do we define our moment? How do we define our generation? That's the first thing that a lot of people look to. And in terms of humanities are typically underfunded. If you can say, I have a humanities project that can appeal to an understanding of digital culture, there's just an influx of money for that. So institutionally, video games have kind of become the art form that you analyze. If you're interested in art, but also in digital culture. And so because of that, they have, it's just easy for journals to take off. It's easy for grants to take off. It's easy to create new majors. It's easy to create new, faculty tenure track positions. Because like universities are fighting to like, okay, we get a video game scholar. And that's, again, the conservatism. This is not universally true. Like there's still pushback against video game studies too. But like there is also excitement around video game studies. If we produce this program, we're going to get undergrads like running from the hills to join this video game studies program because they want to be game designers, because all of the money in academia is from computer science and computer scientists. Like all my students play video games and they take computer science and they want to be game developers and things like that. And so like the whole institutional apparatus is designed to support video game research. Board game research won't ever have any of that. It just won't. But I think just the broader openness of academia to other things is going to create a space that is good for everything else that's left out. So it's not just board gaming. It's just like any other, like LARP or cosplay or, reality TV or like just all these fields that have been previously marginalized that are all growing. Again, we're not all having meteoric rises the way video game studies did. And board gaming can also benefit a little bit from the rise of video game studies too, because like, if an institution creates a game studies program, it's not impossible for them to offer at least a few classes or things that are related to tabletop in there. So it's, I don't want to say that there's, and certainly theoretically, there's some overlap as well. So it's not a strict competition between board games and video games, but there are some ways in which the dominance of video games also helps board games feel overlooked at times. And so people will have a game studies journal where they publish theory of games and you read the theory and says, this doesn't work in tabletop because what they mean is video games the whole time. And so like that is a problem. So we are in kind of, it's a good and bad mix, I think, in terms of that.
Fair enough. And then before I ask you a couple of softy questions, you've done an article about Risk. You've got a book about Catan. What other kind of game-related scholarly projects are on your menu?
So right now I'm working on this blog, The Looking Glance. And so I'm really just trying to extend in some ways what I did in the book of having these conversations that are somewhere between academic and popular. So I'm calling it like personal and philosophical reflections because I want to engage myself as a player. I don't really think of this as academic writing, although I think if you read it, it'll be obvious that I am academically trained. But, like this conversation that we had about the institutions and the publishing, I think I kind of realized working on this book, well, if I'm not beholden to doing things in a certain kind of set format in order for my job to exist, then can I actually expand myself? Can I push into spaces that I'm not as, familiar or comfortable with, and actually just develop a way of having these conversations that is a little bit more in tune with, gaming culture and a little bit less in tune with academic culture. And for me, it's been really wonderful and fun. I feel like I'm becoming a more playful writer in some ways. And I think that academia has a big work play problem. Like we take things seriously in a way that makes it feel like work. And your earlier question about, well, is this going to make game nights less fun? That's because of the work play binary, the feeling that the writing has to be workmanlike, which is going to take the fun out of things. And so for me, I'm really trying to do philosophy that is playful in a way, not necessarily silly, but playful, like engaging in the concepts and just saying like, I could just turn this idea over and over in my head and put that out on the page. And that would be just like a fun, engaging experience for me. And hopefully for my readers as well. But I really want to, to like push into writing that's really, challenging me to engage in it in a way that's more playful, more game-like, and is, I think, more appropriate to the medium. I think that's also part of the problem that people have writing about play is that we always have this emphasis on the thesis, on the argument. Like, I want to say this specific concrete thing. I want to make this particular concrete interpretation. And because games are so slippery and because they can transform and they're malleable and they move around, it's a little bit harder to come up with a concrete thesis on a game. And so I think if you can learn to love the journey of exploring and having both sides of the issue and things like that, I think the more that you can actually kind of develop a writing mode that fits with what's uniquely good and valuable about games, that is itself fun. And so that's what I'm getting excited about these days.
Nice. So I'm assuming you're playing games. What have you been playing lately that has brought you some joy?
Yeah, so the big one lately is I dusted off my old copy of Seventh Continent. So I've been soloing that after I don't know how many how many years since the last time I played it, and it's really interesting. I think this is. I don't know if it's a game that I love per se, but it's a game that interests me. So I'm digging into that. My game group is we're going through Journeys in Middle Earth campaign. So that is a game that I do love. That's one of my favorites right now.
Nice. And then if people want to follow you online or check your work, where do you like to be found?
Yeah, I am on Blue Sky and BGG as J Ray Lee, so JREYLEE. My blog that I just talked about is lookingglance.com. And the book itself, Unsettling Catan, is on the University of Michigan webpage. And important note that it's not just available for pre-order, but it is an open access book, which means that in November, when the book is published, everybody will be able to read the ebook for free online. And so a big part of like we talked about the goal of reaching an audience, but the press is putting their money where their mouth is. And we want to reach an audience by literally making this information available. And that's not on me at all. I had nothing to do with that. That's all the props go to the press for doing and funding that. But that's something we're also so excited that we're able to they were able to make happen. So that's great.
That's fantastic. Jay, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm very excited about your book, both in itself and as the launch of something bigger.
Yeah, thanks. I'm very glad to be here.
All right, everybody out there, thanks so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.